Sure. Hi, everyone. It is my immense pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker who's coming remotely. She couldn't make it in person. Jessica Flanigan is someone I look up to and I'm very grateful for. With her book, Pharmaceutical Freedom has been such an inspiration and it made me feel more emboldened and like, okay, I'm not crazy, right? Like there is backing to the things that I've been thinking. So I would love to give her the stage to give a presentation about why patients have the right to self-medicate. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion, interaction with you as well, and see how that goes in a more dynamic, interactive way. Take it away, Jessica.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I'm just going to share my screen here, and then you can see my little PowerPoints. Oh no, Lawrence, actually, can you do the PowerPoint? For some reason, Zoom Workspace does not let me share my screen for the one that you have, but you got it too. But I can just talk through it either way.
You need permission?
I don't know. Let me share the screen. I'm sorry, guys, but I can also just talk if that makes it easier for you.
I'm not sure.
For some reason, it won't let me do screen sharing here.
Can you try to screen share right now?
I try it. Let's see what we got. Oh, it might work here. Let's see. Share. Does that work? Looks like it works. Okay, cool. All right. So, hi everybody. It's nice to be here. I'm Jess, and I'm going to talk today about pharmaceutical freedom. And I think it's helpful to think about the rights of self-medication in terms of the history. So the idea that people didn't have rights to use whatever they wanted or put whatever they wanted in their bodies or medicate themselves or make their own medical decisions, that's actually fairly new. Before the 20th century, the clinicians were very paternalistic, doctors know best, that kind of model. It was widely recognized that people had rights of self-medication when it came to pharmaceuticals, what kinds of drugs they used. And this was before pharmaceuticals were as developed as they became in the 20th century. But public officials would say, just as a man has the right to decide what to put in his own body when it comes to matters of medication, so too does he have rights of freedom of conscience. And it's like amazing to think that people were using rights of self-medication as a hook to justify rights of religion or freedom of conscience, which are rights that we now think are so sacrosanct, while people don't widely acknowledge rights of self-medication. So what happened? In the 20th century, there were a series of drug disasters in the United States that motivated public officials under public pressure to enforce more pharmaceutical regulations, specifically prescription requirements and pre-market approval requirements. And this, progressed and it had steadily more regulation, and other countries started to follow suit, responding to these types of drug disasters, adapting their own kinds of restrictions on self-medication. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, we all know of stories of people who advocated for rights of self-medication within specific disease categories. So cancer patients advocated for more compassionate access and rights to experimental therapies. And that picture on the slide is from an AIDS activist from ACT UP, advocating for rights to investigational drugs as the AIDS epidemic was progressing. But we still live under a system of the early 20th century from 100 years ago of widespread restrictions on self-medication. Why is that bad? It's bad because regulations on pharmaceuticals, regulations on the right to self-medicate have created an invisible graveyard. So we all see people who die of their diseases, but we don't see the people who die of their diseases because of pharmaceutical regulations that prevented them from accessing the means to save their own lives. So the invisible graveyard is created by drug regulation in two ways. The first is drug lag. People die just waiting for drugs to get approved, waiting for drugs to come to market that could have saved their own lives. The second way that pharmaceutical regulation kills people is through drug loss, which is probably more relevant to your group here, which is because there's such a difficult regulatory environment in most rich countries, which have drug formularies that pay for drugs through the state insurance systems or subsidized insurance systems, it's highly regulated industry. And because of that, a lot of drugs just are never going to come to market and no one's even going to look into it. So, for example, longevity drugs are really underrepresented because the regulatory structure makes it very hard for those drugs to be developed. And insurance and payment systems are not developing a market. They're unlikely to go into formularies. And so, this huge regulatory apparatus we have changes where investment goes and what kinds of drugs people invest in. And that's called drug loss, which is the ways that regulation deters innovation and the deterrence to innovation kills people. We've seen now, kind of mixed with success, more movements towards drug legalization. For example, the right to die or the right to try movement, and patients are getting more involved in the drug development process. And I think that that's like all to the good. These are all great developments in empowering patients to have more rights to make medical decisions about their own bodies. So I think this should be extended to prescription requirements. You should need a permission slip to access a drug that you think will benefit you, just in the way that you shouldn't need a permission slip to make any other kind of, influential decision about your health or your nutrition or your body. But these are noteworthy: drug legalization, right to die, patient-driven drug development, and right to try, because they stand out against a background of widespread regulation, which has negative health effects for everybody, which are difficult to see. Because when people die of regulation, it looks like they were dying of their diseases, but they were actually dying of unnecessary regulatory delay or deterrence. So why would I be so concerned about rights of self-medication? The first reason is just what I said earlier, which is that people die because of limits to their ability to access beneficial medicines. But there's also a rights-based argument. So just as you have rights to refuse treatment, rights of informed consent, even if it's a deadly decision. So you say you have a deadly disease and you say, you know what, doc, I'm done. I don't want chemotherapy. I'm just going to refuse any further treatment, even though that's going to be very bad for your health and you might die because of that refusal choice. We still respect that right as sacrosanct. We say we can never force a person to undergo treatment against their consent. But the same reasons that we should never force a person to undergo treatment without their consent are also reasons that we shouldn't forcibly withhold treatment. So think about it in this way. Imagine that Lawrence has been bitten by a rattlesnake and is about to die. And I have the antivenom that can save his life. But a regulator comes in, Sam, and is like, well, wait a minute. I haven't tested how Jess made the antivenom. And so I'm going to step in here and prohibit him from accessing it. Not only is that bad for his well-being, because now he's going to die of the rattlesnake bite or whatever, it also violates his rights of self-defense. So if people have rights of medical self-defense to save and preserve and improve their own lives, those rights are imperiled by these regulations, which use the apparatus of government to forcibly prevent people from defending themselves against illness and disease. We think about medical rights in these ways when it comes to things like medical aid in dying or abortion rights, the rights to make decisions about your own body, even if it's like not going to be good for your long-term health, even if it's a risky choice, even if it's a morally risky choice. We should think about these types of bodily rights more robustly, though, and call out political authorities that try to limit our authority to make our entitlement to make decisions about our bodies. So going forward, what would it look like to have real rights of self-medication? If you like the FDA, if you like EMA, if you like Health Canada, if you like your regulatory system, keep it. Fine. I'm just saying that those agencies should be analogous to like private certification. So it should be the case that, public officials can certify drugs as safe and effective, but they don't make that certification a necessary requirement for access. We see this right now where people will engage in medical tourism to like be able to find which regulatory environment is more favorable to their own medical interests. If we had a public certification pathway, people could also choose what kind of public certification they thought was going to be most aligned with their own risk tolerance or preferences over risk. And insurance providers could also choose public certification pathways that they thought were most aligned with their own risk tolerance. And then thinking about the medical tourism example, we also should consider maybe just a principle of regulatory reciprocity, which is if there are these very risk averse or risk intolerant regulatory structures, I think that they should accept regulatory certification between each other, knowing that a drug that passed Canada's regulatory system is likely to be acceptable to American consumers, or a drug that is available in America is likely to be acceptably risky to European consumers, because all of these systems are comparable in their level of net risk tolerance. For people who are willing to take on more risk, I think that they should be able to use contracts and the civil law to just waive their rights to sue, to waive liability. So that would require a kind of tort reform, which would enable people to say, I want to take on more risk in my medication choices, and I'm not going to sue you for it. So legal rights of self-medication would potentially lead to like just more regulatory options for people, because we wouldn't have this permission slip system, we'd have a certification system. So why not do it? What's the problem? Well, for one thing, public officials have bad incentives. They're very worried about a public drug disaster that they'll be blamed for, but they don't see the risk of people blaming them for regulatory delay, partly because when people themselves die because of a lack of access to medicine or suffer because of a lack of access to medicine, they're going to attribute that suffering or death to the diseases rather than to the regulatory delay in a lot of cases. There's also a lot of status quo bias. So the philosophers use this idea of like the reversal test, which is, imagine that you like the status quo. Well, if you think that we shouldn't have more regulation, we shouldn't become more regulated, but you also don't think we should become less regulated, that reversal test will shift the burden of proof to think, well, how could we justify the status quo as optimal? What is it about our current point where we shouldn't reverse course and deregulate, but we also shouldn't accelerate and re-regulate and regulate even more? The fact that we don't have good reasons for thinking that, oh, we shouldn't have more regulation, we also shouldn't have less, that indicates that maybe people who have a preference for the current regulatory status quo are influenced by status quo bias. Now, if there were rights of self-medication that were more widely recognized, that would require kind of a culture change. I think people would have to be more accepting of the fact that sometimes people are going to make self-medication decisions that are not going to be in their interest, and they're not going to be able to hold anybody liable for it. They're going to have to take on their own risks themselves. And that's going to mean that legal institutions are going to have to potentially shift in a ways before public opinion could kind of lag to follow those changes. I do think that there's a possibility that there could be kind of market failure in the pharmaceutical industry, because a lot of regulatory agencies are so complex that only really big companies can navigate them. And so there's a kind of regulatory capture by these big companies, and large pharmaceutical companies in that way, surprisingly to some people, could be a barrier to progress, because the current system is favorable to them because they have the resources to navigate the regulatory environment, which small companies don't. And another barrier to progress is like maybe bad science could just mean that like it actually is really dangerous to have people self-medicating. And if the science isn't good, I think there could be potentially enough drug disasters that it wouldn't be popular. But I think there's a lot of opportunities here. And I just listed on the slide some opportunities for just like small incremental improvements. So if you're thinking like, where should we start if we really value self-medication? One thing is, I think, just thinking about rights of commercial speech, letting people talk about off-label uses and publicize different ways to use existing drugs. That's like a kind of low-hanging fruit as I see it. I think that we should rethink the approval system in a way that just allows more incremental improvements around right to try or compassionate use, not just for terminal illnesses and life-limiting illnesses, but for chronic conditions. And looking at tort reform, rethinking the unconscionability doctrine, which is the idea that sometimes certain kinds of contracts and agreements can be so bad that no court will uphold them. Most common law legal systems around the world will have a liability system where there are certain rights that you just can't waive away. And I think that those types of legal doctrines would maybe need some rethinking to pave the way for self-medication to be a realistic possibility. So thank you so much. That's that. I'm gonna stop sharing, then we'll do Q&A.
Okay, so I have like two questions, but meanwhile, feel free you guys to think about this and gather up the questions. It actually shouldn't be just question and answer, but rather more of a discussion, in my opinion. So we can have a bit of back and forth. My main thing just kind of around voice versus exit. So I usually think, okay, it's important to try to reform. I mean, 80% of the effort should be on reform, using our voice to change the existing system. That also, I think, has an edge. And 20% of the effort should be on building parallel systems where we can do this. How are you thinking about reform versus building a new system outside of existing jurisdictions?
Okay, I might have a hard time following the Q&A because it's like there's like a big echo or something, but I think that the question was about voice versus exit and like how should we allocate resources between like reforming existing institutions versus just like providing exit options for people, things like medical tourism or alternative regulatory environments. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Better now if I'm here next to the computer or?
Yeah, it's
No.
like really echoey. I think it's like the microphone is like there's a microphone on the computer, but there's also like a microphone. Maybe that's what's going on. It's just hard to hear. But if that's the question, to the question, I just am kind of an all hands on deck approach. So I think that it is unlikely that large scale regulatory environments are going to change without having some kind of exit alternative in another place. So being able to have a proof of concept that self-medication can work on a small scale, I think will be really helpful for motivating rights of self-medication on a large scale. However, eventually, large markets are going to have to reform because you can have small exit options in some cases where people can kind of have tourism and go to markets and like less regulated places like medical tourism to Turkey, for example, or that kind of industry. Um, that's possible. But if you're really going to address drug loss, the idea that there's not enough incentive for innovation in underrepresented drug categories, you want to have a very large market incentive to induce innovation within those categories. And that's going to require large scale regulatory reform in a big market. So somewhere like Europe or the United States or Canada, Japan, like those types of places. So I think that the drug lag, people lacking access to existing therapeutics, having exit is like a really important thing. And I think that just building support for reform is great that there are these exit options, but I also think voice is going to be important if we're really going to address the problems of drug loss because they're such big markets.
How are you thinking about the philosophical ideals that you are, I think, generally advocate for, the ideal of how it should be, versus the practical steps of how do we get from here towards that ideal?
Yeah, great question. So I had a little bit of that on the side when I was just saying, we can't just like overthrow all pharmaceutical regulations today and just be like, oh, this is great. Because there are cultural changes that are kind of small steps towards progress that are going to be necessary to eventually support a more just pharmaceutical regulatory environment. So the ideal is full self-medication, that everybody can just do whatever they want with their bodies. We think about self-medication the way that we currently think of informed consent. And there's good reason to think that that's possible because in 1968, 90% of oncologists in the United States reported that they regularly lied to their patients about a cancer diagnosis. And now that would be unconscionable to us. We'd be like, oh my gosh, like 90% of oncologists are lying to some people about whether they have cancer. That's such a violation of informed consent. But just 50 years ago, that was widespread and normal. And so change can happen quickly, but change has to happen quickly through kind of an underlying cultural shift, right? And so in order to get to the ideal, which I think is a feasible ideal, people will need to sort of like microdose on pharmaceutical freedom, I think. And so that's why I said, in terms of practical small steps, just finding ways, for example, to permit people to have access to information about their options. So things like direct to consumer drug marketing or off label drug marketing, making common cause with freedom of speech in that way. I think that that's like a way in that like a lot of people recognize the value of free speech and that they have an interest in learning information and that there is censorship in this market. And that could be like one small step that's like more feasible and attainable where we are right now towards pharmaceutical freedom.
What do you think about IRBs?
I don't think IRBs are good. And the reason, I mean, I think IRBs are good if they're voluntary, right? So I think that it's probably good for private manufacturers to have IRB for their own internal ethics. But a thing that IRBs do that is destructive, the way that they operate often, is that they fail to recognize the heterogeneity of people's preferences. So some people have different tolerances over risk and benefit, and an IRB steps in and they say, you know what, we're going to decide what the appropriate balance of risk and benefit is before we approve a trial to go forward, before we approve this kind of medical research. And that imposes a normative judgment about whether or not participating in something is acceptably risky on people who might not share that normative judgment. So I've done some work on, for example, challenge trials, which is people who want to be voluntarily, exposed to COVID or some other kind of illness so that researchers can study the effectiveness of vaccines very quickly or the effectiveness of treatments very quickly during a pandemic. And IRBs sometimes are opposed to challenge trials because they think it's unacceptably risky to be infecting healthy patients with an illness. But that's not the IRB's decision to make. That's the participant's decision. As long as they're fully informed and they consent to participate, they should be entitled to do it without having to get a stamp of approval from some academic that doesn't have any understanding of their life. Or similarly, thinking about IRBs prohibiting payment for participants, where you can't have any inducement to participate, only compensation for participation. That's also a normative judgment. Like, people on IRBs are not well placed to make that decision. It should be the participants who get to decide that.
There are conservatives, right? People are concerned. Maybe, patients don't have medical expertise and pharma companies or biotech companies are going to take advantage if there's no IRB, if there's no regulatory agency as well. So what's the response to these concerns?
Oh, sorry, what was the concern? It's hard to hear it, but try again.
Patients don't have medical expertise, and pharma companies, biotech companies might take advantage of patients if there is no IRB, if there is no regulatory agency.
Yeah, I got it. So yeah, I think that we should think about participation research the way we think about more like employment and less like being a patient in this way. So people take on all sorts of risky jobs, and some people think that certain risky jobs are exploitative. And when you ask, like, oh, what do you mean by exploitation? They'll sometimes say, oh, well, the person's only taking that risky job because they lack better alternatives, because all of their alternative options are unacceptable, which is like, that is a really bad situation that a person has to expose themselves to high risk for low reward because all of their alternatives are worse. But the correct response to concerns about exploitation is that you should try to make a person have better alternatives. You shouldn't take away the option that they judge to be their best option available. And so, if you think about like classic cases of exploitation, like sweatshops or something like that, people say, oh no, that sweatshop, it's so exploitative. Those like poor laborers who are working in the sweatshop, they're only there because otherwise they would be, married off or, doomed to a life of subsistence farming. And so that's why the sweatshop is bad. But the thing to ask is, who's worse, the sweatshop owner or you, who's not helping them at all and who's trying to take away what they judge to be their very best option? Similarly, with medical research, a lot of people who participate in medical research are only there out of desperation because they don't have any other better options by their own light. But taking away the last option of a person who's already basically run out of good choices doesn't help them. It only harms them more.
Any other concerns about this? Or any other questions that also found, but I also want to talk about address the concerns. So, other concern or another topic? Question.
Sorry. We had this, sort of broad joy experiment for everything that's with the credit cards for the machine, and those were made to use on to the dimensions. Do this because, do that, you can't really make a judgment call on that experiment.
Oh man, I totally. No, can you repeat it for me, Lawrence? I'm sorry.
Okay, so I was just wondering how, ethically, how the broad joy experiment will trigger incidents of the credit card for a jury commission. Because it's very hard for a commission to do no harm if they don't have any data, so no really harm.
Get that? So how to, well, that's the right to try interface with Hippocratic oath. It's very hard for a clinician to do no harm
Yeah.
if you don't know what this experimental medicine does.
Yeah. So when people think about the duty to do no harm or the Hippocratic Oath, sometimes they think that what that means, how we should interpret that, is that clinicians should always promote the medical interests of their patients and not the overall interest of their patients. But if that was the standard, that clinicians should always just be focused on like patients' overall health and like the integrated functioning of the organism, that kind of idea, focusing on medical interests, then that would mean that we couldn't have a lot of sports medicine, you couldn't have cosmetic surgery, or so many other parts of medicine that expose people to some kind of biological risk, could impair their health long term, but which promote their well-being overall. And so because we allow cosmetic surgery or sports medicine or all sorts of other kinds of like kind of enhancement medical interventions, that indicates that really what medicine should be focused on when thinking about harm isn't medical well-being, it's overall well-being. But then if the thing that a doctor should be focused on is overall well-being, then even if they think that an investigational drug for a patient, something with like the right to try type cases or something like that, even if they think that that could imperil their patient's health, they're only experts about medicine. They're not experts about the patient's life as a whole. So, for example, there was a patient once who wanted to try an investigational glioblastoma, like brain cancer vaccine therapy that had a very high chance of killing him quickly, shortening his life even more than his already limited life, but had a small chance of extending his life long enough for him to see his daughter get married. And so it's medically risky, but it could have been good for his life as a whole to just have the chance to like see his daughter's wedding. And a doctor would say that vaccine, that investigational vaccine for your brain cancer, it's too risky. We can't allow it. But the doctor's only an expert about the medical risk. The doctor wouldn't know anything about, his daughter getting married, his overall well-being, whether or not the risk of a long life was worth the trade-off against foreclosing the possibility of a medium long life. And so because of that, I think when doctors think about do no harm, they shouldn't be so narrowly focused on medical harm. They should think about overall harm to the patient's well-being. And then they should acknowledge that when it comes to overall well-being, the patient's the expert, not the doctor.
Great. Any other concern that ideas? For example, one is antibiotics or overuse of medication that actually cause harm to society at large, cause harm to others if people are taking more antibiotics than they should, causing resistance or other symptoms like that. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so there's two ways that you could have a worry about social costs. One are worries about decisions that really do put other people in danger. So they impose risks on other people. So things like harms of contagious transmission or antibiotic resistance or vaccine resistance or something like that. So that's one kind of cost that you could be concerned about. And another kind of cost is the social cost that people's risky decision-making imposes on socialized healthcare systems. So the first kind of cost, totally agree. I mean, this is just ordinary public health and, you know, a good role for government, which I don't say that very often, like, what's a great thing that government can do? A great thing government can do is manage and regulate the built environment in a way that provides these public goods like safety from contagious transmission or sanitation or clean air. And we should think about regulations on things regarding like contagious transmission in that way. Now, I do think that we should, you know, be clear-eyed about it. And we should acknowledge that sometimes people are going to impose risks on other people and it's worth it given the benefits. So we let people drive, for example, even though driving is catastrophically dangerous, at least in the States it is. We let people own guns, even though we know that that's a risk of more violence in some way. And, you know, in a free society, more people are going to die because of risky behavior. And we can make those trade-offs. But it is legitimate to try to regulate people from exposing other people to excessive risk of bodily injury for themselves. That's totally justifiable. But another kind of social cost is the cost that people's risky medical decision-making imposes on socialized healthcare systems. And that kind of social cost, I don't think is legitimate because if a person has a right to healthcare, say, then the fact that they're going to exercise their right does not make them like preemptively liable to be limited. So if I have a right to police protection, for example, and I think I would require like more access to like the legal system or the rule of law or whatever, if I like walk through a dangerous neighborhood, it wouldn't mean that like then the government could like track me and prevent me from walking through a dangerous neighborhood. Like if I have a right to the protection, I have a right to it, and then people have to uphold that right regardless of my behavior. If you don't think that there's an enforceable right to healthcare, which is, I think, is probably how most people think of it, it's just a decision we make. It's an act of beneficence. We're providing people with healthcare because we want to, not because they have a enforceable entitlement to it, but because it's just how we want to structure our society. Well, there again, you should give people the option to then waive their entitlement to that. So take a person who rides a motorcycle without wearing a helmet, and you say, oh, well, you should wear a helmet because if you get a head injury, it's going to be so much more expensive for everybody else to pay for if you weren't wearing a helmet. Well, maybe, but then you could also have somebody just put like a sticker on their license that says, I'm waiving my right to those emergency services. Don't pay for it. And then it's like, oh, well, but we want to pay for it. Well, then pay for it. But then that doesn't mean that you can like restrict my liberty preemptively just because you're going to want to pay for something later that you don't have a requirement to pay for. It's just like you're doing it because you want to. So I'm very unsympathetic to the social cost argument when it comes to this idea that because people's fellow citizens are going to want to pay for their health care, that entitle their fellow citizens to restrict their bodily rights.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited that you're putting all these ideas in such a coherent, awesome way. Because I really do believe that this alternativism is holding back innovation. You have a question, a burning question? Yeah. Okay. Very quickly, what do you think will be the strength of the schooling of the Supreme Court on the difficulty of getting them? General parents opinion on the difficulty of approving something in the US. The Supreme Court's ruling on Chevron.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so how would Chevron make a difference here? Is that the thought? Yeah. Sorry, I'm like cobbling through these questions. I think I can hear it. But Chevron was this idea of deference to regulatory agencies. And I do think that there's an opportunity going forward now that there's not a presumption of Chevron deference to really look into what has been happening at these regulatory agencies. One thing at FDA that is concerning is a lot of public policy is being made by just like mid-level bureaucrats that have very little legislative accountability. They're unelected, and they're making meaningful policy. So just to give you one example, I was just researching drug importation doctrines, right? And there's a person at FDA who sets the cost benefit analysis for drug importation policy. And it's just like some guy, right? But what that person at FDA is doing is essentially saying that manufacturers who want to export drugs to the US market, which is extremely hard to do, have to meet his idiosyncratic standards of how he's going to judge cost benefit to the US consumer of like allowing this drug importation, which he just made up. Like it's not in legislation, it's not in statute or anything like that. And because of this person's standard, the US doesn't have any drug importation in any state. Like we've yet to import any drugs, right? And you'd be thinking like, well, wait, like Congress authorized drug importation from Canada for the United States. Why don't we have any drug importation years and years after congressional authorization? And it's literally just like this dude at FDA is like, here's how we have to do an analysis of the cost and benefits to the US consumer. And the way that that's interpreted makes it so that you effectively can't have drug importation, even though Congress has authorized it and it's totally legal, but just the way that that's been interpreted and enforced by some totally unelected and unaccountable bureaucrat makes it so it's impossible. So like the state of Florida sued FDA over this recently, and FDA kind of backed off their policy. But now that we don't have Chevron deference, I think we'll see a lot more cases where these types of decisions, which are made fully outside of any kind of legislative oversight or accountability, no transparency about what's going on, will be subject to more scrutiny. And I think that'll be a good thing that we can have kind of more accountability for the basically just total authoritarian powers of the administrative state in the United States right now. So I think it's good.
Great. Now, these ideas, this work, they might just form the basis for our only chance to make it in this document to actually accelerate drugs and work speed and have a chance to actually cure aging in our lives. Thank you very much, Jessica. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Well, I hope you guys are all having a great conference, and it was nice talking to you.